Okay, this will be the video for Mexico Part 3 on citizen society and the state. And the good news is this is a pretty short presentation. All right, so like always, we start with talking about social cleavages in Mexico. And like we've been saying in class, there is a divide between the urban and the rural population. And most of the population is an urban population. So under the pre-party, Mexico was mostly rural, and the patron-client system controlled the peasants. So that idea of clientelism was really important, which is kind of the idea of businesses and factory owners giving out favors and giving out rewards in return for support. So that allowed the big businesses and leaders and party bosses to really have a lot of influence over the peasants. Now, as a result of industrialization, we've seen migration to urban areas. And Mexico is more than 75% urban. The literacy rate is about 90%, so that's much higher than it was previously. But that divide still exists, and it's also connected to geographic divides. So we said earlier when we introduced the geography of Mexico that we do see some divisions and cleavages between the north and south. The north tends to be more prosperous because it is more involved in trade from the United States. It's more industrialized. There are more members of the middle class there. Education rates are higher. There's more access to education. In the south, we see that's where most of the indigenous population lives. So it's more Amerindian, and it also involves typically lower incomes and fewer opportunities for education. So social class, is another part of this, and these all really go together. Social class is important in Mexico. We do see some pretty high economic inequalities where we see a pretty strong and stark division between rich and poor, but we are starting to see some growth in the middle class in Mexico. So the next one I would mention would be the ethnic divides. So unlike, when we talked about China, we see quite a few ethnicities that are present, especially along the borders. Same with Russia. We saw quite a few different ethnicities. In Mexico, we're really talking about mestizos and Amerindians. They're the two major groups. About 30% of Mexicans classify themselves as Amerindians, and those are the indigenous people. They are more likely to live in marginalized rural areas in the south and to live in poverty, whereas mestizos are those who typically hold most of Mexico's wealth and then also live in the north. So as I've been sort of explaining this, you can probably see that many of these cleavages are coinciding. These are, there are many coinciding cleavages in terms of geography, ethnicity, income, class. These really go back to the regionalization that exists in Mexico. Political participation. So this is exciting because we get to talk about actually some pretty strong examples of political participation. So as we've been saying, under the pre-party, the patron-client system was really strong. As the country has modernized and industrialized, we're seeing that decrease a little bit, and we're seeing more authentic participation. This is really long, so just be forewarned. Okay, so here's some positive examples of protests. So if you're asked about what participation looks like in Mexico, you could point to political protest as an often successful form of political participation. Remember, political participation and protests are not exactly the same as civil society. Civil society is a voluntary organization that is joined. In 1968, we had an early student protest in Tlatelolco Plaza. This was a sort of an uprising by students who wanted more of a say in the government. They were protesting against one-party rule, and the government responded very positively. They responded by co-optation, which means they began to include the protesters in the political process. The president at the time hired many students into his administration. They provided students with an advisory role for the government. So they really placated the students and kind of met their demands by giving them that voice. So that was a really successful protest that happened. We also saw a pretty successful uprising in Chiapas in 1994. So Chiapas is a pretty poor southern Mexican state. So, in the south, if we're talking about people who are in poverty, typically this is an area that is dominated by Amerindians. This group in particular was really strongly and poorly affected by NAFTA. So they were sort of victims of the increasing poverty, and they felt like the government was ignoring their needs and began to protest. And President Fox at the time attempted to incorporate Zapatistas into the government, attempted to give them a voice, just like we saw in 1968. And as a result, the federal government now tries not to ignore this area by also increasing the social welfare that is available to the area. So, for instance, the government supplies electricity and water to the villages. And in 1968 and in 1994, we saw social welfare programs increasing as a result. Somewhat less effective happened in 2006. There was a protest in Oaxaca, and this was a teacher strike, for a number of reasons. They perceived the election of the governor to be unfair, to be rigged and corrupt, and they also were protesting low wages, many times like teachers do in the United States. So they were protesting the authoritarian rule of their state. They were calling for the resignation of the governor. So the strike was quite lengthy. It went on for several months. It eventually was subdued. Eventually, federal troops were called in to sort of put down the strike, and the governor refused to resign and was able to retain his seat, but not without federal intervention. So the teachers, successfully, made their voices heard, even though their demands were not met in terms of the resignation of the governor. They were permitted to protest. It gained somewhat widespread attention. There were many media outlets who actually refused to cover it, so that their message could not get out. But when we think about comparing this protest to, what protest looks like in some other countries we've studied, still we see people having a voice in Mexico. So political participation continued. Voting behavior before the 1990s, the pre-party controlled elections on the local, state, and national levels, voting rates were typically pretty high because, again, many of the party members and party bosses were were promising jobs or promising other forms of rewards for those who would support them. So that brought out people to the polls. We've had competing parties since the 30s, technically, even though the pre-party has dominated and has often, the incumbent candidates have typically selected their successors. 1994 saw the highest voter turnout in Mexican history. That was 78%. Now it hovers around 60%, so that's pretty comparable to what we see in the U.S. in terms of voter turnout. Interest groups. So, as we talked about, the pre-party practiced state corporatism. We've talked about this in class, so that's a formalized relationship between interest groups and the state. Interest groups in this system were divided into three sectors. Those were labor groups, peasant groups, and groups of the middle class, and they all contained groups that had formalized relationships with the government. Civil society. So even under the pre-party, civil society has existed and has been allowed to exist. Political parties are sort of the primary civil society organization, so the primary voluntary organization that exists in urban Mexico, especially today now that we have competitive elections. And the parties sponsor they go beyond doing what our parties do here. The fundamental goal is still to get people elected, but the parties really work toward recruiting young members and being active in their communities by sponsoring sports clubs, sponsoring youth activities, and hosting celebrations for communities. So this is another way of trying to gain support within the community. The pre-party's downfall, when they began to be weakened, civil society was the source. There were certain businessmen within the pre-party who were not incorporated into the government system. They felt like the party had ignored them. They weren't involved in they weren't allowed to be involved in the organization. And this is where we initially began to see the weakening of the party. So civil society is incredibly important to people. As we mentioned in class, 83% of Mexicans practice Catholicism, and we do see a freedom of religion, though, in Mexico. So we've seen a recent rise in the existence of Protestant churches, and so that demonstrates the openness of civil society. The government is not dictating what type of religion people should practice or what types of groups people should join. Non-governmental organizations and professional organizations are very common, especially active in Mexico City, which is the capital of the federal government. So obviously, it's the nation's capital and it's the seat of government. So again, some similarities here. Obviously, NGO is very active in the United States. Professional organizations are active, and that is a parallel with Mexico. And unions also are powerful and have a voice, especially those associated with the pre-party. And that is it. So, I went through that rather quickly, but feel free to go back and pause and take your notes. You will need to know this information for our test, which is on the block day, and some of this might be helpful for you as you are completing your reading guide. And have a great long weekend.